Here.
Alonso.
Here.
Hooper.
Here.
Marzo.
Here.
Potter. Ryder.
Present.
Fisher.
Here. Great, thank you very much. We will now move on to general public comment. General public comment is for things that are not on the agenda. Each person that wants to give public comment will have 3 minutes to do so. Please raise your hand, and I'll now hand the controls over to our moderator, Mr. Roberts.
Thank you, Chair Bauer. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now for the 3-minute timer. If you don't see the hand raised, that will be at the bottom of the screen. I'll call on participants in the order in which they have raised their hand. Up first is Terry Shore. I will ask again that you just state your name for the record. Terry, I've allowed you to speak. You'll need to unmute yourself.
Yes, good evening, everyone. Chair Hauer and members of the Petaluma City Council, planning staff, and members of the public. Yes, I submitted some written comment. I wanted to bring to your attention the draft environmental impact report that is now out on the County of Sonoma scattered housing rezone. And this is a project that has been in the works for some time, where the county intends to rezone parcels in a scattered manner around the county for by right medium density housing. And 4 of those parcels are land that is inside the sphere of influence and the urban growth boundary of the city of Petaluma. So I thought it would be of interest to the Planning Commission, the City Council, and the Planning Department to make comment on those parcels and whether or not you agreed with the proposed rezoning. Greenbelt is concerned about this project for a number of reasons. One, it's the first time, at least since I've been in Greenbelt Alliance, that the county has proposed to change land use in areas that are in the sphere of influence of the cities. We're also very concerned that the draft environmental impact report finds significant and unavoidable impacts that cannot be mitigated in 2 critical areas: wildfire risk reduction and vehicle miles traveled. Those are 2 of the biggest issues facing us in Sonoma County and our cities. If this goes forward as proposed, that means that even with lengthy mitigation spelled out in the EIR, that more people will be exposed to wildfire and VMT and associated tailpipe emissions. Greenbelt Alliance is, of course, in support of affordable housing and housing in city center growth. But this proposal comes in advance of the county's update of its housing element, where we will be able to take a bigger look at the big picture. And this even says that the proposal would exceed established population and housing forecasts. So, any case, we will be making comments on it, and my job right now is to alert the communities across Sonoma County that this is out there, and the deadline is coming up in June for public comment. And I hope the city of Petaluma will please comment.
Thank you, Terry. Up next, we have Susan Kirks. Susan, I've allowed you to speak. You'll need to unmute yourself.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I just wanted to say thank you to Terry Shore with Greenbelt Alliance for bringing this issue to the attention of the Planning Commission. And if Terry is still listening, Terry has my email address, and I would very much like to receive a copy of the information that you have for Petaluma. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. And that looks like that is our last attendee participating in public comment. And with that, I'll pass it back to Chair Bauer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Roberts. We'll now move on to committee comment. At this point, I'd like to invite Councilmember Fisher to give her report.
Thank you. So we had a rather lengthy goal, the first of two. It was to talk about our goals from the past 2 years and introduce some new goals. And our next meeting will be to actually prioritize those goals so that staff knows what to expect over the next 2 years. And then we had a council meeting last week as well, but I don't think there was anything on that agenda that pertains to this commission. So that's all I have.
Okay, thank you very much, Councilmember Fisher. We'll now move on to the Pedestrian Bicycle Committee, who will be reported out by Commissioner Hooper.
Thank you, Chair Bauer. Our last meeting was April 7th, and we had a few items. One of our main discussions was the climate emergency framework presentation that we received, and we spent a bit of time talking about ways where PBAC can integrate into that, and also discussing how that can relate more to our long-term development. But to be honest, it was mostly general discussion, so there's nothing very concrete to report back on. Beyond that, we were looking at very needed Lynch Creek Trail upgrades, and also upgrades to Prince Park, and some possible Class 1 pathway improvements. That's about it.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Hooper. We'll now move on to the Tree Advisory Committee, reported by Commissioner Marzo.
Thank you, Chair Bauer. The Tree Advisory Committee met on April 21st, and I did have to leave a few minutes early, and we had some technical issues. But the main element of our meeting, to piggyback on Commissioner Hooper, was we had a terrific presentation from Patrick Carter regarding the climate action framework, and how the Tree Advisory Committee, can really be an integral participant. And it was a great presentation, and it really brought forward how each of these separate committees can play a role in advancing the framework that the city has set forward. And so Patrick Carter did a great job presenting, helping us to see the nexus of how the Tree Advisory Committee can help with the city council and our community's actions and the climate action framework. So that was the majority of our meeting. I do want to report that this Friday, and I apologize, I'm just looking at my notes. This Friday is Arbor Day, and a past participant of the Tree Advisory Committee and a great friend to Petaluma, Matthew Corey, passed away last year. And this Friday for Arbor Day, and I just got the notice from Parks and Rec, there's going to be a tree planting at McNear Landing this Friday at 1 p.m. I do believe there's also additional work that's going to be going on at the same time. So it is Arbor Day, but I do want to recognize people who've really participated to help the city on their personal committees, and so the Tree Advisory Committee felt it was important to honor this past member, and so I wanted to put that out. But in final note, the tree technical manual continues to be developed, and that's something that's going to be coming in front of the city soon, and lots of people are working hard on it. Thank you, Chair.
Great. Thank you very much, Commissioner Marzo. We'll now see if any other commissioners have any general comment or questions. Okay, I don't see any. So we'll move on to the staff comment, which will be given by our planning manager, Heather Hines.
Good evening, Chair Bauer, commissioners. So first, I just want to follow up on Ms. Shore's comment about the release of an EIR. The county has released, it's not the notice of preparation, it's in fact the release of the draft environmental impact report. County anticipating needing to accommodate about 3,800 housing units over the next 10 years in anticipation of the regional housing needs allocation for the county for the 6th cycle. So they looked at, I believe it's 50 or 60 sites in unincorporated county and looking at rezoning those to provide housing opportunities to help meet the future RHNA numbers that the county would be facing. So it just released, I believe, last week, and I'd be happy to send a link to that on the Sonoma County Permit Sonoma's website for those that may be interested in looking at it. Additionally, so the only thing that I believe was on the last council meeting before the goals and priorities that we did last night was the second reading of the modifications to the implementing zoning ordinance flood, I'm forgetting what it's called now, the equipment, the freeboard for the equipment. So that was approved, and we're now in the 30-day referendum period for that. The all-electric code that we spoke about will be before the council on Monday of next week. And as mentioned by both Commissioner Hooper and Commissioner Marzo, we are looking at scheduling a time when Patrick Carter can come and talk about the framework, the climate emergency framework with the Planning Commission as well at a future meeting. And that's all I had for this evening.
Great, thank you very much, Planning Manager Hines. I saw most of us shaking their head that they might want the information from Sonoma County. So if anybody doesn't want it, raise your hand, but otherwise I think you can safely send it to all of us. Thank you.
You bet.
Okay. Okay, we'll now move on to the approval of the minutes for the April 13th, 2021. If anybody has any edits or comments or revisions on that, please let me know. Okay, I don't see any, so we'll go ahead and approve those minutes. And then we'll move on to our next agenda item, which is the objective design standards. That's for state mandated streamlined project review for our affordable housing. And we are going to have our planner, Christina Paul, present that to us. Thank you very much.
Yes, Chair Bauer and Commissioners, thank you very much for having me here this evening. So I am going to share my screen, and please let me know if you have any difficulty seeing it. And I would like to let you know that it's perfectly fine with me to stop me and ask me questions if you feel less inclined while I am talking. So what we've done here is just provide essentially a summary of the staff report, which I'm going to be going through, and a little bit of the background on the objective design standards and this effort as it has been underway for a little while. So first, to define what an objective standards are, what an objective standard is. The objective standard is one that requires no personal or subjective judgment by anybody, public or private, to understand what it could be, that it's uniformly verifiable, essentially that's measurable, and that an applicant who would bring a project into us would be able to know ahead of time what the standards are that they would be expected to comply with. Another way to think about it is through this example of fences. So one subjective way to regulate fences or to say that fences should be constructed of high quality. Another way is to say, as you see on the right, that fences can be of brick, stone, et cetera, but chain linked, barbed wire, et cetera, are not allowed. So you can tell very clearly in this case what is allowed and what isn't allowed. This is what we're moving towards. And as we discussed in the staff report, a major motivator for this work is the recent state laws that require that we put some projects, those that are what's the word? Those that can apply, those that meet the standards for particular benchmarks are processed using objective design standards. They're not all universally processed using the objective design standards in the same way. So for example, SB 35 and SB 330 rely on these objective design standards in different ways, but we are seeing a direction from the state that we are going to have to be expressing what applicants are going to need to do ahead of time, at least somewhat more clearly than we have heretofore, because it has been acceptable to provide sort of general guidelines for what a project should be, and then we'll talk with applicants as the project evolves. And the state wants to see affordable housing projects, specifically in housing projects in general, move through more quickly. So they're requiring that we use these standards. So we're planning to update the IZO. We're going to support the SMART code approach. We are not going to be applying new objective standards to the SMART code area, to the SMART plan area, although we could put in a couple of adjustments if we feel that that's necessary. And these objective design standards could be used in the future if the city decides, for example, as part of the housing element, which is part of the ongoing general plan process, to identify specific areas of town where ministerial review would be possible for particular projects. We would, again, though it's the discretion of the city and not the state, be relying on these objective design standards. I just want to call out these few questions that we'll be posing later on. Do you support the core principles? There are other considerations that you would like us to take into account as we shape more specific standards. Are there general topics that you feel that we haven't covered? When we think about the general topics that we're covering in the objective design standards, do you think the mechanisms that we're using are the right ones? Do you think we should add or remove any? And finally, are there particular community engagement strategies that you think that we should use to get feedback as we develop these standards? So I want to very quickly, this is something that we talked about back in, I think it was June, when we first discussed the objective design standards process, essentially what Petaluma has right now. So for most projects, we have site plan and architectural review guidelines. These are subjective guidelines. So we're talking about quality, we're talking about in keeping and character and harmony. And so what we've been doing is working on how do we make these guidelines more subjective. So if we're looking at quality, we can specify materials or we can specify length of use. On project siting, we can do more detailed setbacks, et cetera, et cetera. We do in the IZO have some objective standards. Those include heights, densities, setbacks, allowable uses, and parking ratios. As part of this particular design, objective design standard effort, we are really working on reinforcing and adding to what we already have and not changing any of the more fundamental requirements in the IZO. So that does include density, that does include parking ratios. But as we mentioned in the staff report, that is something that we can look at. Each of those are things that we could very well look at as either part of the general planning process or as a separate effort to think, for example, about parking ratios. As I mentioned, the SMART code is something that we're going to be reinforcing. The SMART code and the SMART plan area have quite extensive objective design standards. And so for that area, we're going to be relying on those. We're not going to be as detailed. This is like a 120-page document. We're going to be aiming for somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 20, but we're going to be trying to cover all of the major bases and really learn from the SMART code what works and doesn't work. I also want to highlight that we have existing an existing building code and Petaluma specific building requirements, and we'll be continuing to rely on those and working not to impact the building code too significantly. We have Cal Green Tier 1 with an all electric requirement now. So we could work on complementing that, but if there was an effort to really look into the building code, that would be also a separate effort. This is really focused on the look of a building and its siting, and less the function of the building and its sustainability features, although we are doing what we can within this context to support more sustainable buildings, to support multimodal transportation, et cetera. So I got into this a little bit earlier, but there are a variety of different kinds of projects that can use these objective design standards by state mandate. And these vary a little bit by the specific bill that they are applying for streamlining under. But we're designing these objective design standards with a big tent mentality. So we're trying to make sure that all of our objective standards fit with all of the requirements of the specific bills that we have right now. So for example, SB 330 requires that we use objective standards for all projects more than 2 units. So everything that's a duplex or more, and also any mixed use project where 2/3 of it is residential. And then other bills like SB 35 have different requirements for compliance or eligibility, is the word I was looking for earlier. For example, SB 35, if we need to comply with that because of where we are with RENA, which we do right now, those projects need to be at least 50% affordable. So these specific objective design standards will not apply to single family homes and ADUs. They generally, projects that require a general plan, community plan, or zoning update are not eligible for streamlining. If applicants decide that they do not want to comply with these objective standards, they are more than welcome to go through a discretionary review process. So these standards will be specifically for projects that are being streamlined. Again, we're not going to be changing the smart code. And if the project is deemed to result in a significant health impact, then again, it would not be eligible for streamlining. I'm going to just briefly, as I mentioned, each of the different bills have different requirements for streamlining, but I want to capture the overall concept, which is fairly universal across each of them. For each of them, planning staff receives either a preliminary application or a full building application. We will route that through the usual city departments that we confer with on planning projects, for example, fire and police. Our specific timing and process depends a little bit by the streamlining protocol. For example, SB 330 is not a ministerial review process, or does not have a ministerial review process requirement, where SB 35 does. And you've seen a couple of SB 35 projects come through. And we talked a little bit about SB 330 at an earlier meeting, but I'm happy to rehash. And then once planning approval is received, assuming that it is received, then each project still needs to submit for building permits and go through building code compliance. So what we are trying to achieve is a base level of design quality in these streamlined projects to essentially ensure that. So we are trying to manage for the lowest common denominator, but we're also really trying to make sure that there is some flexibility within this framework so that we can encourage uniqueness in buildings, and character and differentiation, while still meeting this sort of these base requirements. And we want to be able to respond thoughtfully to these state mandates and protect the city from legal challenges for working to impose what might be considered non-objective standards, and set the stage for future standard work that I talked about, like the parking ratios, et cetera.
Can I, before you jump in, Christina, can I add that I believe under SB 330, a project could be a single family home project and fall within SB 330. So there may be times that we're looking at this for single family projects. And I'm confirming that this is true with either Christina and or Dylan, but as you know, these bills are coming fast and furious from the state, so we are doing our best to keep up as they come, and each one's different, and they are not easy to read. They are not easy to kind of apply. There's no one set of rules. So, but I believe there are times when we will need objective design standards for single family projects, if that was what was proposed under SB 330.
Yes, thank you, Heather. So I think that the differentiation between what I was saying and what Heather is saying is if it's like one single family home, SB 330 doesn't apply. If it's a subdivision project, then it does. Thank you. Okay, so in our process of developing the objective design standards, these are the approach steps that we've taken. So we, back in the summer of last year, discussed the preliminary direction with Planning Commission. We reviewed 4 examples of different cities and how we could think about what we wanted to do. We drafted some principles that we'll go through and worked to follow those. We reviewed best practices from other cities. We interviewed 14 design and building professionals. And I want to emphasize again that we worked not to introduce new standards that would impact established standards such as setbacks, building heights, or density. And we focused on revising the existing regulations and direction and providing clarifying language. These are our 4 standard principles that we were working towards. We wanted to design for sustainability within our scope to support connectivity, and that includes multimodal transportation, to strengthen community character and the public realm, and to design equitable and accessible places. One of the things that we really did focus on was allowing creativity and flexibility. So we're trying to promote the idea of choices, not necessarily a point system, because we discussed that in the previous meeting and decided that that was not the direction, but we could do something like, you must choose 2 features such as some of the following 6 to 8, rather than being really prescriptive and saying everybody must have balconies, for example. We looked at 12 or more different examples of objective design standards. These first 4 are those that we reviewed last time around with the Planning Commission. And as I mentioned, we interviewed 14 different folks. The list is in the staff report. That included groups of affordable housing developers, architects, and folks who are architects and sustainable building experts in the group that's bringing the SDOT AIA team to town, hopefully shortly. And these were held in February. And what we did when we spoke with these folks is essentially to talk about our overall direction and hear what their concerns were, what they may or may not wanted to see. Very interestingly, many of the affordable housing developers weren't super concerned with the external standards, and many of them had their own objective design standards, and really wanted, from that perspective, not to have to put in features that would reduce their possibility for affordable maintenance. So, for example, I think it was Eden Housing said, please don't make us do balconies. They leak. We've just found that it doesn't work. And the conversation with architects was really interesting because they were saying, we really do want flexibility and an ability to be creative and unique without being in this box, but also really understood, like, yes, we do have to manage for the lowest common denominator in this situation. And there is always the opportunity to go through the discretionary work process. And I want to note that the folks from SDOT sent us a lot of great suggestions in terms of specific standards that we could include. Some of them were a little bit outside of the scope of what we can accomplish as part of this process, but we included them for you all to reference so that they can be carried forward. And if we're looking at parking or density or building standards that are referred to in there, then we can keep bringing those ideas up. So I'm going to fairly quickly, I know I've been talking a lot and you have all of this in front of you, talk about the kinds of topics that we're planning to cover. We really want your feedback on this and the general direction that you think that we should take with each of these. The next step is going to be to come back with a draft of all of the objective standards for you to really get into the weeds on. We wanted to make sure that our approach was right before we did that. So these are the topics we're going to cover. We're going to cover massing. So that's the overall volume and shape of the building. And that includes massing breaks that are horizontal and step backs, which happen as the building gets higher. We want to think about how, in the SPAR guidelines, it says we want high quality. So how do we think about that? So we're offering the idea of facade detailing. You can provide balconies or other options, and then potentially articulating the facade as we go up and down the building. Engaging with the street through transparency. You have to have at least 75% of your ground floor be transparent so you can kind of look in and out of the building. That's with mixed use building. There is a differentiation in our thinking between purely residential buildings and mixed use buildings where you want to have more of that relationship with the outside world. With entryways, this is something that came up in some of the comments on the SB 35 projects. How do we make sure that those entryways are highlighted, are, they feel significant, they feel welcoming. It's just not like another door that you don't really identify with. So that's something that we're going to think about, and think about how far those can go in and out of the facade. We want to make sure that buildings are accessible from the public street, as well as any kind of parking that's in the back. Roofs can be important parts of buildings. They can help with character. And as we think about denser and denser buildings, they can also be usable open space. And we don't really want to see AC units. So we are addressing screening for those and other mechanical features on top of the building. We want to highlight the Commission's direction around the importance of river access and river orientation. So that's something that we suggest highlighting. And then as we get to site design, as we start thinking about where does the building go on the site, we have to think about access as well as a few other things. So when we think about access, we think, okay, yes, cars will probably need to get into parking areas, but we want to make sure that driveways aren't super wide. There aren't lots and lots of driveways, so that as a pedestrian, that you can still traverse those facilities, you still feel safe. And if the project fronts on the river or on a creek or on some kind of trail, that you can actually have access through the project to that amenity, so that we're really trying to create a network of mobility options throughout the city. We want to make sure that buildings are highlighting not only their access areas, but also their corners. How can we help them to build a sense of place by building kind of landmark elements or identifiable elements or unique elements at the corners, and again, provide access from public streets. On landscaping and open space, we want to support the existing standards that the city has. And for example, the tree manual that Commissioner Marzo was mentioning earlier, it's something that would be great to refer to. But when we're thinking about landscaping, we're thinking that we would like to encourage native plantings. We're going to we suggest requiring a minimum percentage of softscape. So that's like not pavement, not road, plantings on a site, and that we prohibit the planting of particularly fire-prone new plants adjacent to buildings. This is an example that comes from Marin. There isn't a Sonoma County one, but we can talk with DPW and Parks and so on to develop a specific list for Petaluma around trees and shrubs that we would recommend not planting. When we look at denser buildings, we also often see private or semi-private open space. So we are planning to provide a minimum percentage of common open space with landscaping or permeable surfaces, seating so that it's usable, and minimum square footages so that, again, that they're really usable. Fencing, I didn't have any quips about that, but we wanted to make sure that we don't have visually repellent and unwelcoming fencing. Lighting, if in pedestrian areas, in order to ensure a sense of safety, we are recommending that there be minimum lighting requirements, and also that lighting is shielded. There's a dark sky requirement, which indicates this kind of approach where essentially you make sure that there's no light leakage up, and also that you try to keep the light fairly contained where you want the light so that you're not impacting habitat areas. Thinking about parking, while we are not specifically looking at parking ratios, we are looking quite deeply at where parking should go and how it could be oriented. If we look at on-site parking, we're recommending that that be unbundled. So the spots wouldn't be assigned to particular units. This actually allows you to build fewer parking spots and can make residential units more affordable, because you don't have to pay for parking that you don't want to use. We want to prioritize bicycle parking by allowing it to, or by requiring it that it be accessible. And really, this is a big one, that larger parking areas be located behind a building so that you don't see the parking in front of a building and have that be the first impression of the building. But really, we're working on having the street be kind of like a public room with buildings on either side, and you're not separated from uses by large areas of parking. We're also looking at structures. How do we make structures fairly friendly and integrated into the urban form? And here again, we're prioritizing a pedestrian-focused streetscape by pushing parking into the back, requiring pedestrian access that connects parking lots and building entrances, and so on. And then where there is parking, ensuring safe pedestrian access, minimum curb cuts and minimum curb widths, and that all of these facilities are ADA accessible. Again, we're promoting multimodal mobility by prioritizing bike parking. There's been some conversation about whether or not we can increase the bike parking ratio, which we can continue to talk about that, but that might come as part of the vehicular parking conversation, and that we need buffers between bike parking and automobile parking. Thinking about prioritizing or promoting the use of electric vehicles, we are thinking that we would prioritize the locations of electric vehicles so that, you know, those electric vehicle only sites or parking spots would be near vehicle entrances, building entrances, so that you would be more motivated to get one of those vehicles. And we of course want to comply with at least the minimum Cal Green requirements around electric vehicle parking, of which there are quite a few. We can talk a little bit more about that. So in our next steps, back in June of 2020, we had a preliminary meeting to get feedback from you all on our direction for this. We have presented our rationale and a draft of mechanisms that we could use to develop more specific standards. We're planning to come back in a couple of months with a draft of these more specific standards for discussion, which we would then take forward to the City Council. And throughout this time, we are planning to do community engagement. We have not, as staff, really dug into a proposed approach for community engagement. So if there are particular insights that you would like to offer us, those are very welcome. I do want to note that we did let everybody who already participated in our interviews and so on know that we'll be providing a draft for them to comment on. So we'll certainly be doing that. So here are our discussion questions. Do you support the 4 core should be principles that the objective standards will focus on? Are there others that you think should be added to the list? Any additional general topics that you think that we should add? What do you think of our mechanisms? And are there any tips on outreach that you would like to offer? Are there, just before we launch into that, are there any questions of me that you want me to cover before you begin to respond? Councilmember Fisher. I'm sorry, Chair, it's not my job.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say we usually have been doing public comment first before questions to you. So if it's okay with you, Councilmember Fisher, if we do public comment first and you ask your question after. Thank you. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for the most excellent presentation. We will now take a minute to do our public comment for this agenda item. And I'll let our moderator, Mr. Roberts, take over from here.
Thanks, Chair Bauer. I don't see any attendees with their hands up at this time, so I'll just remind our attendees, if you'd like to participate in public comment, simply raise your hand at the bottom of your Zoom window. I see Susan Kurtz has now raised her hand. I will share my 3-minute timer. And Susan, I have allowed you to speak. Once again, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Hi, thanks. I don't think I'll take 3 minutes, but I wanted to say thank you for the presentation. And just 2 documentation or resources for you all. Recently, Madrone Audubon Society of Sonoma County prepared a tree and vegetation planting list that interfaces with habitat areas and different types of birds and wildlife that benefit from certain ways of planting and certain types of planting. And that was contributed to by Paula Lane Action Network, the other nonprofit that I lead that has over 20 years of in-depth experience in native planting and habitat protection here in Petaluma. So that's available on the Madrone Audubon website if anyone's interested, www.madroneaudubon.org. And I also provided a copy to John Shribs of the Tree Advisory Committee to interface with the interest in a lot of tree planting for shade and carbon sequestration here in Petaluma. And provided a copy to some of the members of the new tree planting group. So I'd really encourage you all, and I know that the city has a very long way to go in terms of enhanced awareness in this particular area, but it's really important. And of course, it's part of the climate emergency. And then the other piece of information I'd like to share with you is I just recently completed a wildlife corridor and wildlife crossing mapping for our area here in South Sonoma County. It's one of 3 that I'll be doing. It's the first one. And Green Info Network is helping formalize this. So I will make that available to the appropriate individuals and to your commission when the mapping comes out. And the reason that that's relevant here is for building, even if you're applying objective building standards or otherwise, you'll want to look at areas of Petaluma where established wildlife corridors exist, consider habitat protection and planting and lots of other things, and wildlife crossings as well. That's also part of the climate emergency. So thank you very much for accepting my information tonight. And I wasn't one of the nonprofit leaders who was asked about this, so I'm very pleased to be able to provide you with information that's based on many years of habitat study, field observations, and planting and habitat protection.
Thanks for your comments, Susan. I don't see any additional hands raised at this time, so I will stop sharing my screen and pass it back to Chair Bauer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Roberts. We'll now close public comment for this agenda item. Now we can move on to commissioner questions for Ms. Paul, and we'll start with Council Member Fisher.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Christina. You said during, when you're talking about the 4 core principles, the 4th principle you said was design equitable and accessible spaces, but yet in the documentation you leave out and accessible. It seems like that should be added in.
I completely agree. That was a little ad hoc.
Yeah,
like, this is missing
something. Yeah. And then going back to one of your first slides when you were talking about where the standards don't apply, and you said that they don't apply to projects that would have a significant health impact. And presumably that would be determined in looking through at the CEQA process, right? And can you tell me a little bit more about how you see that working?
Yeah, the bar is very high there, but Heather, do you want to talk about that anymore?
Well, what I wanted to say is there was a couple of these streamlinings that exempt a project from CEQA.
Right.
So both SB 35 and I think AB 2162, both, if you qualify for processing under those bills, you are exempt from CEQA. So I want to be clear on that there's not a lot of pause to look at some of that stuff, or the ability to ask for the typical laundry list of studies that we do when we're doing CEQA. Christina, you might, or Dylan, you might be able to respond a little bit more to the high standard with public health. I think that was the term used specifically with objective design standards. And it is a good point. How do we determine that if we're not doing the CEQA analysis? Because that's usually when you're looking at that is through, polluted sites or greenhouse gas emissions or noise or, some of those kind of analyses.
Yeah, my feeling is twofold. I think thing one is that I would need to go look back at the bills again because they are so complex that I don't want to speak out of turn. Also, I think that it's fairly unlikely that a project that does comply with our current zoning and general plan and so on would meet those standards for being a public health risk. But we can certainly circle back on that. Dylan, do you have anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I was just going to add, Heather and I, we were looking at SB 330 today. So it is possible to not approve some developments through SB 330 if there are specific adverse impacts, and that's defined in the bill as a significant, quantifiable, direct, and unavoidable impact based on objective, identified, written public health or safety standards, policies, or conditions as they exist on the date of the application was deemed incomplete or deemed complete.
But SB 330 also doesn't exempt you from CEQA.
Correct.
So we would be able to identify some of that through the CEQA analysis. So where I think some of that gets a little more complicated is when you have a project that is exempt from CEQA, on what would you see with the project that would trigger that, and how would you have that basis? Clear as mud.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Especially since we don't really have any public health standards that I'm aware of. The other question that came up was when you talked about siting and how a building would be sited on the property. And did you think at all about, its orientation, north, south, east, west, so it could become a passive building structure?
Yes, that's a great question. Because so many of our buildings are infill buildings, and our site boundaries are, and where the streets are and so on are defined, it seems like it would significantly decrease the efficiency of site design if you required that the whole building be kind of tilted on the site to maintain optimal solar exposure. So we did not ultimately go with encouraging passive solar or requiring passive solar. We did talk about managing shadows cast on nearby public uses, for example, because if a large building casts shadows on a park, it would make that park much less usable. So that's something that we're looking into, but maybe it would make sense for us to think about larger projects if one should come up, to think more about the passive solar orientation. Do you have any recommendations? Your input is very welcome.
Let me get through my questions first. And in terms of my last question, in terms of parking behind, are you just referring to surface parking? Are you differentiating between a parking structure and surface parking? And could it be in the center, for instance, like I think the Haystack building was designed that way?
Mm-hmm. Yes, Texas Donuts are definitely allowed with the parking in the center.
I never heard that.
That's the technical term for this. Yes, that would certainly be allowed. The intention is really just not to have a sea of parking out on a public street or on the main street. And we have said essentially that all parking would be in the back, although some parking structures could be on more minor streets, rather than arterials.
Mm-hmm.
And we also started talking, and again, these are not fully fleshed out, so we're kind of like trying to bring down the discussion, but some of the things we did talk about is wanting to make sure that when there is a parking garage, that it's not vacant, kind of void at the street level. So, if you are going to do a parking garage, making sure that, for instance, you have a storefront of a certain depth that runs along the street side, or other ways to make sure. So the Haystack example where the building basically wraps around it would take care of that because it would be in the middle. But that's one of the things that we have talked about is in the downtown area, while structured parking might be an important part of that, we want to make sure that you're not walking down a street and that's what your experience is a dark kind of cavern of parking.
So why would we allow a structured parking to be on the street front?
Well, we may not. We may. So what one of the things we were talking about is requiring, for instance, potentially requiring some sort of street fronting use to take up some portion of, you know, of the setback from the street. At the same time, you're going to have to obviously have some area where you're driving in or out of the parking structure, but trying to figure out ways to make sure we're buffering that. I know this came up when we were looking at North River Apartments, and there was a requirement that they had 3 street frontages. So there was discussion, you know, obviously there was commercial on the Petaluma Boulevard elevation at the ground floor. And at the Water Street, there were, I believe it ended up being some like tenant amenities and making sure that that parking was in the smart code, what's called the, you know, the second or third layer. But then they also had Oak Street, which is then a slope street. And so I remember the Planning Commission having that discussion when that was looked at and reviewed on how do we try to buffer that from the pedestrian. So that's some of the stuff we've been talking about putting into objective standards.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Fisher. We'll now move on to Commissioner Hooper.
Thank you, Chair Bauer. I have a few questions. One I wanted to start with, why were parking ratios and density and height questions, why were those left out of this discussion now? Is it that going through the housing element timeline-wise, it's going to lead to the same place, so splitting resources made more sense? Is it a restriction in the bill, or is it just a resource prioritization issue?
Sorry. One of the things we wanted to make sure is we did not want to create more restrictive. The idea was not to create more restrictive requirements for an affordable housing project that comes in under one of these streamlining, right? It's to create objective standards. You know, the parking issue is definitely on our work plan to bring forward and have some study sessions and discussions on that. That was reinforced, you know, at the council goal setting last night, and the discussion of goals that was re-emphasized, and that is one of the things that is on staff's list. So that has just been a bit of a resource, trying to balance resources. So some of those discussions I think will come up, and then those could be changed, and they would apply both to a standard housing project and one that might fall under the Streamlined bill. But we wanted to be really careful that we weren't creating new or more restrictive for our affordable housing projects through the objective design standards.
That makes sense, especially in the parking. I was just curious with regards to, although as much as we'd rather parking kind of go away, I was just curious with regards to any kind of height restrictions being able to alleviate that issue, or allowing for a certain amount of upzoning now if we think it's worthwhile, so that we can kind of get through some of these potential projects.
Mm-hmm. And also, I do want to just mention that a lot of the affordable housing projects, I feel a little bit like a broken record when we get projects in trying to encourage density bonuses to try to get, you know, increase your affordable housing ratio on your project, and then you get a density bonus, and then you can ask for concessions. And density bonus provisions also have a reduced parking ratio, or you can ask for a concession to even go lower.
Okay. Yeah.
You know, so we kind of have a tool that we can use too for affordable housing projects to provide that extra flexibility, maybe to go up taller, reduce your parking, those kind of things.
Okay.
The other thing that we wanted to keep under consideration is that we didn't want to trigger a major CEQA effort as part of this process. I mean, we will be looking at density extensively as part of the general plan, but we kind of wanted to make sure that we had these standards available fairly soon, in case we, you know, as we get ongoing applications for expedited processing.
That's fair. And then to pivot away from that a little bit, I really appreciated that you reached out to SDAT and really loved kind of the extended document they provided with much more kind of green focus, sustainable development. One of the comments in the staff report was that some of this would come up in REACH code and kind of that discussion separately. Is that on track to be resolved anytime soon? And I only ask because what I worry about is when we make these standards later and then the folks in these units who might not be able to afford these changes have to pay for it on the back end.
Well, the all electric code is, we're trying to get that adopted first. So that is there. And, you know, we even since that code was before you, and in response to some feedback we got from Climate Action Commission, we expanded the applicability of that to apply to substantial, I think we call them substantial remodel of existing housing stock. So we are trying to, you know, we tried to push that further in response to the feedback we got from the commissions. And then as we talked about when we were before you with that was, we know this is one step and then we're going to start working on the next step. So it was, we wanted to be careful. That gets more and more complicated when you start dealing with existing housing stock. And we didn't want to get stuck with that and then not be addressing the new construction. So that's why we moving forward with that, but we are already talking and gathering input on what's next. So I think it's a extremely high priority. I just can't, I don't know exactly what's next in terms of what the form and what it will cover. We heard a lot last night about EV, so I would anticipate that that will probably be, you know, one of the next thing is pushing, you know, the availability of EV chargers, but also the requirement. Maybe that comes as part of the parking discussion. Maybe we're adding in EV parking requirements into our parking requirements. You know, I just don't know exactly what form it's going to come in yet.
And as one arm of planning is working on these more immediate amendments as part of the general plan, we're doing a climate action plan. And so it may well be that some of the implementing policies are to implement that kind of building code update.
That's fair. One part related to that, and I apologize if this kind of leads to a similar tone of answer, but I just wanted to check. One of the things that I keyed in on that document was the WUI building standards. And I wasn't sure, and I just wanted to confirm whether or not we already follow that in our code or if that's something we're planning to adopt at some point.
That is a good question. And I can't answer it I can't fully answer it. I'm not sure if my colleagues can answer exactly what pieces of that are in code versus what we need to expand in our building and fire codes. Anyone have any add or support?
Heather knows more than me, I'm afraid, on this one.
I can follow up with you, Commissioner Hooper, follow up with all of you, or take that as kind of a comment. But I don't want to speak out of turn, and so I want to check back in with my colleagues in building and fire about what exactly is codified at the moment.
That would be great. I appreciate it. Thank you. Especially because if it's already there, then it's something we don't have to worry about. But if it's something to add, then it kind of adds an urgency to it. So I really appreciate that. Outside of that, I had a whole lot of questions about parking ratios, but realized that that is not necessary now. I appreciate that. For the kind of the note about EV charging and parking. I understand that that's kind of you put it as a placeholder. This is something you want to look at, and we'll come back and look at it in more detail later. But I was just going to ask because I wasn't entirely sure whether or not the Cal Green standard called for a type 1 or type 2. I was only going to ask if you could push for a type 2 just because type 1 charging is slow and it's a lot harder from a practical perspective to make use of that, especially since our public charging infrastructure isn't so great at the moment. So that was just one thing I wanted to throw in. And then with regards to roofline height variation, and this is my last question for now. With regards to roofline height variation, in the kind of addendum that had been provided, they talked a lot about minimizing that variation to improve the use of either green roof or solar facilities on the top of our buildings. And I know we do a lot of variation right now to try and make sure that these projects don't look like boring rectangles, and I appreciate that. But I was just wondering, how well will what they're kind of requesting overlap with what's being proposed now? Because again, I recognize that this was kind of a general placeholder. I just wanted to see if that was the direction that planning was thinking of going towards.
And that's a really good point. And it's not something that we discussed in a huge amount of detail. You know, yes, it's a good point. And I think we should continue to look at it. It's easier to build an efficient solar facility on a flat slab, or at least a consistent slab. So maybe that's something that we should consider letting go of as a requirement.
Or just have variation to the guards surrounding it, just to, even if you want the appearance of that.
Right, the parapet as opposed to the actual roof structure itself.
Yeah. Oh, and one last suggestion was calling for the fire certified roof for the, I think they had the 50-year certification. I wanted to emphasize that, if only because it's amazing what embers can do to these roofs when they travel fast enough. So putting that in now for these large structures, especially if we get more solar, feels like it'd be more important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Hooper. Now move on to Vice Chair Alonso.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, staff, for the excellent presentation with lots of important information for us to chew on tonight. I had a question about an attachment B, kind of just piggybacking off Commissioner Hooper, under building methods and assemblies. Commissioner Hooper touched on letter A, but I was wondering letters B through G, what were staff comments on those? Are those also for further discussion? I didn't really see those called out in the staff report, so I was curious what you all were thinking on those ones as well.
I'm sorry, Vice Chair Alonso, I missed the document reference because I was taking notes.
Oh, no problem. It was an attachment B from Ann Midster and Pete Gang. Looks like on page 2 of their memo, under number 4, building methods and assemblies. They raised some interesting points. A through G is their full. Commissioner Hooper touched on A. I was just curious what staff thought about B through G, and particularly on the materials on B and C and G, kind of what staff thought about those recommendations, and if we were going to incorporate those, or were you wanting us to give you feedback on those specifics?
I'm having trouble pulling that document up, but I think that if there are particular standards in there that you would recommend us including, then please do call them out. Where we could, we pulled over specific standards into our draft. We do have a draft, but before we got into the weeds with everybody, we wanted to make sure that our approach was correct. So if there are particular ones that you think we should include, please do note.
Okay, thank you. And then attachment C, the feedback from the community stakeholders, which is very helpful. So I appreciate all that information. There's a discussion that I'm interested in getting your thoughts on, or maybe getting some more clarity on, under number 3, design expectations and affordability. There's a lot of bullet points here about space and amenities and retail space. And so it looks like some of the stakeholders felt that this is towards the bottom of number 3. It says retail space and mixed use development is difficult. More requirements can make these projects even more infeasible. And I was just curious, we have a lot of discussions here on the commission about, mixed use and retail, and what were staff thoughts upon hearing that feedback? Was that feedback universal, overwhelming from the stakeholders, or Just what were your thoughts, or could you provide some more detail there?
Yeah, so in these particular standards, we are not planning to adjust the requirements for mixed uses or ratios for commercial spaces as part of residential or partially residential projects. It is certainly a common refrain to hear that the retail spaces in mixed use buildings do not pencil out and that they are loss leaders. Some developers end up partnering with retail specific developers to try to make those spaces as feasible as possible. But that's something that we're going to be discussing at length, I'm sure, as part of the general planning process. We have a bunch of economists on hand to help us think about how do we right size our retail as a city and in particular areas, and then how do we play that out in our building standards and requirements for mixed uses.
I will add two things to add to that. One is, and I'm not exactly sure how to work this into objective design standards, but we are having more and more discussion with applicants on the mixed use front to be more creative or innovative with what mixed use might mean, because we do hear a lot that, and we all know retail has definitely changed from some of the expectations from 2008 or earlier when we were working on our current general plan. And so we have been trying to, when working with a receptive applicant, to think about different types of what does that mean? What does mixed use mean on the ground floor? What would a retail use mean on a ground floor? Would it be flex space so that we have the flexibility for changes in the market? Maybe it's more like small maker space on the ground floor, or live work space with, the ability to have storefronts on the bottom level, or maybe it's not all exactly the same storefronts, but maybe there's the option to have roll up doors or walk up counter or windows. Just trying to be more creative, that there is different ways to do it and different ways to respond to the needs of the community today versus what the needs may have been when the codes were written. I'm not sure how to exactly deal with that in an objective design standard, because the whole thing about an objective design standard is you are creating something that there's no thought to, right? And some of that is harder to prescribe. So one thing, a rambling thought on that. On your previous question on attachment B, one area that I think would be very helpful to get some feedback from the commission is one of the things in the write-up from Ann Edmonster and Pete Gang was don't allow vinyl windows. Well, we have had a real touch and go with vinyl windows over the years. Our smart code currently says, I don't know if it says straight up prohibits, but it's something like extremely strongly discourages or something along those lines. And there have been times when staff has recommended not using vinyl, and it has not, that condition or that recommendation has been removed because somebody wants to do vinyl and it's thought it's maybe okay. So that's a really great piece of input from this group. If we want to do something like no vinyl windows, that's an objective standard, and that is not coming out of left field. That's something that previously adopted plans have referenced or suggested. So I think that would be very valuable to hear from this group if they want to take something like that into the objective design standards.
And to add a little bit to Heather's ramble, one of the things that we probably will be talking about as part of the general plan is flexible uses. So how can we encourage buildings to be designed so that they can be used for more than one thing? So we can allow multiple choice for a commercial retail restaurant use, but are there also places where we might want to have spaces that could be residential or commercial so that they can be somewhat more responsive to the market?
Okay, thank you very much. That's all I have for right now. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Vice Chair Alonso. I think Commissioner Ryder was next.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Bauer, and thanks so much to staff for this very interesting and narrow problem to try to work around. Just going to your initial question around the principles, want to spend a moment there. I like definitely the 4 main principles that you have identified, especially with the addition of both accessibility being recognized, although it seems that that is addressed somewhat in the connectivity piece, but I do think that accessibility is going to be an important pillar here. This conversation leads me to believe, however, that a 5th principle around resilience may be in order. It's come up from all of my colleagues here that fire needs to be addressed. We haven't talked floods, but just something in that space might be really warranted, in my opinion, to call it out separately from sustainability. So that's my 2 cents on that particular front. I agree that there were, gosh, so much thoughtfulness went into these various documents from the design community as was contributed, and knowing which ones we can apply here is part of the challenge because there's so many good suggestions, but I just wanted to elevate a few of them that I thought were really worth consideration in this space. Several of them fit into the resilience category. I definitely think that that entire section from attachment B around buildings and the WUI standards and considerations for landscape use and things of that nature should be something that we can make objective, as well as the concept of mixed unit sizes and types. Definitely, I see that being an enormous opportunity. Aligning with TCAC standards is one that I actually don't know a ton about TCAC, but I do think that the intent of this entire effort is to encourage more affordable housing. So why would we not align with the standards that come for the funding for affordable housing? So that just seems like something that is worth investigating more thoroughly if you haven't already. I'm also intrigued by things around maximum unit sizes or higher density. It sounds like you're going to deal with that in a separate topic. So that's great, especially related to proximity to transit centers. And I don't know, it sounds like transit center proximity is for density and height restrictions may not be something we can deal with here, but I'd like to put a pin in the opportunity for using that trigger around the potential for density to lead to other accessibility or connectivity issues. For example, wider sidewalks in areas that have higher density might be a good, and might be already part of the smart code. I don't actually know, but definitely it seems like there's a lot that we could potentially put into this space, and you've done a great job of trying to condense it into something that is easy to manage. I look forward to seeing your next iteration of this. Just looking through my list to see if there's anything else. I too would love to see something related to passive design. It sounds like that's not really going to fit in here, but considerations for maximum window wall ratios for west facing might be something to consider, and give an option for overhangs or other ways to minimize internal heat gain as part of these standards might also be things to consider outside of just the building code, what the building code does in that particular avenue. I don't think I have any specific questions at this time, but like I said, I very much appreciate the work that has got into this and look forward to seeing what comes next.
Great, thank you very much, Commissioner Ryder. Back to you, Councilmember Fisher.
Thank you. Great comments, Commissioner Ryder. I like the idea of wider sidewalks and more dense areas. I just want to say I have the utmost respect for Ann Edminster and Pete Gang, and work with them often. And so I would defer to them. I don't really know much about this stuff, but I would suggest that whatever they've recommended, I would fully support. And I would suggest that we all do. Pete knows a lot about climate resilience, and I really like adding that 5th pillar, resilience, so we can fit some of these things into that. That's all I have. Thanks.
Great, thank you, thank you very much, Councilmember Fisher. Okay, if there's no other hand raised, oh, I see Commissioner Marzo.
Thank you very much, Chair Bauer. First of all, thank you to staff. Thank you to all the commissioners for the hard work that we've put into this. I really do appreciate it. I do, just to segue, because Councilmember Fisher did mention, I just want to clarify on the thoughts of the objective design standards. Ann Edminster is mentioned as part of the stakeholders. However, Mr. Pete Gang is not. Can we get like some sort of title or clarification? I'm not objecting to the opinions. I don't know who that person is because they were not identified in the report. So that would be my first request for clarification. I did want to talk about just a little bit regarding the Commissioner Alonso was talking about mixed use, and in the report we talked about transparency on the ground floor, and I think I heard it amongst the commissioners. I think that's fraught with some potential dangers because nobody wants to see, albeit transparent, an empty space. So I would hope that we kind of allow some sort of flexibility. So while it may be important to keep that ground floor transparent, empty and transparent, I don't think really solves anything. So that would be my point there. I really do appreciate the stakeholder interview summary. I think I value the opinion of people much smarter than I am. I thought it was excellent. I thought it was interesting to listen to the perspectives, and I know Commissioner Hooper spoke to it of the parking, and maybe just a general question, because it is in one of the applications, is how we unbundle parking to some of these units, right? And I guess I don't know that you necessarily have the answer, but like, is that a viable solution that we can begin to not bundle people's housing with their parking, and would that dovetail into a bigger problem for us? Because again, so much of this is about affordable housing, and if it makes it more affordable, what are the consequences of making that more affordable? So I'm not necessarily asking for an answer right now, but I did just want to throw out what we continue to talk about parking and what that means, and how does affordable housing, how do we find that nexus of making it all work, both in terms of affordable for the inhabitants as well as the development of these projects? So I just wanted to bring that up as well. On a kind of working my way up to broader points, I did have a question regarding in the staff report on page 2. I just wanted clarification, kind of the third paragraph down, the second full paragraph. It says, these standards will also help guide projects should the city decide to establish areas where housing development may occur by right as part of the housing element process. So Christina, perhaps, or Heather, can you clarify what the current housing element process has to address? What does by right mean?
You want to start with that? Why don't you start with that one, Christina, and then I'll jump in or tag team the others.
Okay. Yeah, in this particular case, what we mean about by right housing is that some cities, in an effort to promote affordable housing development, have developed programs where a project can, by way of its design and levels of affordability, qualify for a ministerial review or something similar, where it doesn't need to go through a discretionary review process. and I won't, I'm trying not to go too far into a rabbit hole in my mind on this, but looking at the current, the requirements for the upcoming housing element, the state has set out some requirements that if we want to reuse some of our, or in fact, any of the sites from our current housing element, we would need to allow those projects to go through with ministerial review.
And some of the thinking there is if you have had sites that for the last, 1, 2, 3 cycles, and you've identified sites in your site inventory, and those sites have not developed, there's probably a reason. They're probably not extremely viable sites for your affordable housing production. And so I think some of that is, okay, you want to keep using those sites, you need to go further to really facilitate that housing development. And by right housing, it takes a lot of the unknown and the time and expense from going through the discretionary review process. So when a developer comes in and they know I can develop through a streamlined ministerial review if I meet these objective standards, that is a much easier, more defined path for a developer than the discretionary review process can sometimes be. So what that paragraph in the staff report is saying is, we're seeing these objective design standards at the current moment to be used with the streamlined review required by the state. There might be other ways that we end up using these as we go through that housing element update and future regulations come out of the state around housing. So just trying to identify that what and how we use these may actually evolve as needed. In terms of bundled housing, bundled parking, unbundling parking, that's something that we have started talking a lot about, because actually it can increase affordability of housing if you can, not be saddled, or it can dissuade you from having parking. So if you don't need parking, why do you have to pay for parking? So if you're able to say, okay, all these units are a certain price, and actually, if you want an on-site parking space, you have to pay more. It's encouraging and kind of a disincentive to have your own personal car, or maybe 2 or 3, if you've got to pay for the parking associated with that. So, a lot of our affordable housing providers, they're locating their projects in areas that are more robust with transit, in areas where there's a mix of services for residents, and with a lower ratio of parking, because people are going to use transit, they're going to be able to walk to the store, get on that bike path. So those lower parking ratios and things like unbundled parking are things often that our affordable housing providers are very supportive of.
Right. And again, I thought it was excellent, and I really appreciated the stakeholder interview summary, just because it gives you a really great set of perspectives, and I thought all the voices were really important. So I do appreciate, I really do appreciate that. I'm just going to end on a final point, which is one of the questions that were kind of asked, is about the 4 core considerations. And I totally agree with Commissioner Ryder's suggestion of adding a 5th. My only concern in this whole process has been, the way I read it was, how do we make subjective objective? And I think the 3rd consideration is very difficult, to strength, community character, and the public realm. I think it's a very gray area, and again, everything I've seen in attachment A of building design, and there's so many things that we can make into objective from subjective. I have a little bit of difficulty seeing how we are going to implement core consideration number 3 into practice. But I'm also in favor of adding consideration number 5 of resilience. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Commissioner Marzo. I'm not really sure who was next between Commissioner Hooper or Vice Chair Alonso, but I think Commissioner Hooper was. No?
No, it was Scott.
Okay, thanks. Okay, Vice Chair Alonso, why don't you go?
Thanks, Madam Chair. Just a quick question for you. Do you want us to also give our comments now as well? Or how do you prefer?
Oh, I thought that question was for Planning Manager Hines. Is
Sorry, I was
No,
looking.
no.
Chair Bauer, it seems like we're delving into comments, but so we're open to any way you'd like to do it. But it seems like we have started going into comments over questions. Is the way I'm interpreting some of
Okay.
the dialogue.
Sounds good. I'll just offer some brief comments. Again, I'm in support of mostly almost everything that's been proposed or thought of tonight. I really appreciate all the stakeholder engagement and the dialogue with staff. It's just a really strong presentation for Petaluma. It's going to, I think, pay off in the future for many years to come. I think just in terms of some of the discussion points or just finer comments, even from attachment B and attachment C, there's discussion over where bike parking would be located. And so I think just for a thought for us is just to make sure that we differentiate between like a large apartment building and just a residential unit, and that because there's discussion over where that bike parking should be and how close to the building entrance or how close to the residential unit entrance. And those things can mean very different things in a large building or in a smaller project. So I just want to give flexibility to the applicant to provide that bike parking, but just, you know, depending on what type of project it is. And I have a similar comment also on the related to electric vehicle charging stations, almost a similar point. You know, I know in the staff report it mentions priority locations, but I think we need to kind of dive into that more. I'd be interested to know what other cities are doing with that and how they're using that language. It relates to parking garages, but my concern right now, and we've discussed it a lot, you know, in the past couple months on the lack of EV charging, but I think we certainly see that in our parking garages in Petaluma. And so I think for objective standards, it would be good to highlight, you know, EV charging stations inside the garage and inside for residents and the public. So there's not some different system available for folks that need to park in a garage. And I agree with Commissioner Hooper's comments on the type of charging station available. I also wanted to bring up, again, parking garages, but also just common spaces about lighting. I thought that was really nice just for staff and to call out in these projects. And I just think we really need to emphasize that for safety reasons. A lot of areas, at least, you know, especially in West Petaluma, when you walk around at night, it's very dark. We are a very dark city at night. And so for safety reasons, I think just making sure we have proper lighting, especially going to and from buildings and common areas and whatnot. So I appreciate the staff calling that out. And I think overall, it's a very strong presentation. And I guess my last question, or one last question is, I know, Christina, you had the kind of the timeline for later this year. Does this go straight to the council next, or does this come here first and then we make recommendations to the council? Okay.
Yeah,
Perfect.
we are anticipating that this would be in the zoning code. You know, we've kind of talked about the different ways to where to adopt it or how to adopt it. But, you know, it would definitely come back before the Planning Commission for feedback on the actual standards, and potentially coming back as a zoning text amendment that you would make a formal recommendation on to the City Council for adoption.
Great, thank you. And then my last thing is just related again to attachment B. I think the call out on building materials and just the accessibility there is really important. And as Commissioner Hooper and Ryder alluded to earlier, I'm in strong support of those provisions, and just especially for natural disaster planning purposes and preparedness. I think that's really key that we call that out as an objective standard. And so I just wanted to highlight that. And I think that was it for me. In terms of further community engagement, I don't know if it would be helpful. There's Know Before You Grow. There's our city community newsletter that comes out all the time to call that out specifically, to get feedback from folks, from the public. I think that's probably one of the bigger pieces that's missing here, is like people who live here, regular folks who, like all of us, live in town. The stakeholder engagement's important, but I think we really need to hear from residents, homeowners and renters alike, and understand, what are they seeing? What are they seeing in newer projects or even in older units, around some of these really important issues. And I agree. Last thing I'll say is I agree with Commissioner Ryder and her adding that core consideration. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Vice Chair Alonso. Commissioner Hooper?
I'll start with my comments and then I'll pivot to my final questions. I also wanted to thank the staff for the reports and the preparation for this meeting. It was really wonderful to have not just the staff report and the proposal, but also the kind of community feedback that you were able to get from kind of more of the experts in the area. I also just wanted to support, much like Commissioner Alonso, really wanted to emphasize excitement and support over adding the fifth pillar that Commissioner Ryder recommended for resiliency. I think that's a great way to frame so many of our concerns with development nowadays, and really wanted to double down on adding those building material recommendations that were made. And much like Councilmember Fisher, definitely agree most of what those two have to say are things that I would listen to. They're certainly the experts in a lot of these areas. With regards to EV and just kind of building off of Commissioner Alonso's point, I did also want to highlight for priority zones, it'd be nice to be able to see how priority zones might overlap with VMT standards, specifically where they might be able to be not a workaround, but a place where existing development might not be so harmful to the environment for increasing the number of EV charging or EV cars in that area, and then to see if we could prioritize in those zones. I know it's a little counterintuitive to our very urban center focus right now, but just for that external concern. I also wanted to make a comment. I appreciated I think it was one of the architects who highlighted the false historization. I'm not going to say this word right, but false historical
Historicism.
I can't say it. Anyway, I appreciated his or her comment, mostly because I do feel like that is so often used to try and avoid increased density, avoid affordable housing, and really move away from what would be considered too modern and then, quite frankly, more amenable to people's needs. So I appreciate that being called out. With regards to bike parking, also off of Commissioner Alonso's point, it would be great to see different standards also applied for some of these developments that are closer to closer to bus stops. And the reason I bring that up is because outside of just trying to bike around town for trips, we also want to see how much we can increase people who are using bikes to get to bus, to commute to work, and kind of really reduce those trips out by vehicle. A lot of our bus stops, yes, they do have bike parking, but when you don't have bike lockers or protected bike locks in the area, it becomes iffy. And based on where some people are commuting, bringing your bike with you isn't always the best option. So being able to look at applying those standards near kind of high traffic bus stop areas would be appreciated. And then finally, one question I did have had to do with a note that came up with the affordable housing developers. They noted that there were standards they followed primarily because of cost. And I understand that, Heather and Christina, you both focused heavily, especially with my initial questions about trying to reduce costs exactly for that purpose. But it kind of veers away after that. And I was just curious to know, were there other standards or other concerns they had that you're already implementing in the draft that, for very understandable reasons, you kind of want to show us later once more comments have been implemented? I'm just curious to know what other barriers are popping up, especially if we're focusing a lot on external design choices.
So with the affordable housing developers specifically, they called out when we asked them what their major concerns were. They really focused on the parking ratios being problematic and really not wanting to provide as much parking as is required, which has caused some consternation with us because, you know, in some of the core areas, the parking ratios are relatively low. But that's something that they called out. And then access points, you know, sometimes providing access, for example, to the back of a project for parking is costly, and also providing access for fire. But those weren't things that we were looking at as part of this.
Okay.
I will say too, you know, over not specifically with a conversation with an affordable developer, but we have heard anecdotally in past projects that the kind of like, you know, adding ornamentation onto a building can add up and can end up making it very expensive. So we wanted to make sure that we don't kind of have so many requirements that it's like tacking on a balcony or this. I think it is much more successful, one, to kind of try to focus on quality and you know, the environmental items and some of those, as opposed to you know, a stone veneer along the bottom, you know, 3 feet of a building or whatever it is. But trying to think about where we want applicants to spend the money on the design. Is it those kind of things like the stone or the you know, I'm just randomly coming up with things, but the Juliet balconies, or we would rather have fewer of those, and we would rather have, you know, the recessed entries at the street front and you know, some of those really quality, lasting over time kind of design expression. So that's one of the things we've been talking about and thinking about is, and Christina brought it up, is kind of like still allowing that creativeness in the design process, and not feeling like, oh, I have to add 5 of these on in order to meet these objective design standard, and you end up with this, you know, applique of design concepts.
And I do want to pitch, I'm sorry if you hear people having a different kind of fun in my house, but I want to pitch that you might want to join the May 17th council session. We're getting ready for a housing session with council, and we have strategic economics and Veronica Tam from our general plan team, who are going to be talking about the ins and outs of the financing of projects in Petaluma. You know, how do we compare to different places? What can we do in the next couple of years to forward affordable housing? And then what are best practices that they're seeing from other cities as we begin to head into the housing element? So this is something that we're really focused on, is really how do we think about the affordability of the feasibility, you know, financial feasibility of these projects.
Thank you. Oh, and one more thing I just wanted to note before wrapping up. In terms of outreach, one thing I was going to recommend, I think the surveys are a great start. I think being able to announce this more on social media is great as well. These are kind of broad questions for us, but in terms of reaching out to Commissioner Alonso's point, more everyday folks, and especially people who might be renting the very projects that we're looking to kind of provide these standards for. Zoom town halls are a great way to go about it. There are a lot of people, a lot of organizations having these events. Know Before You Grow is certainly one, but I'm just thinking in terms of being able to reach folks directly, you could even go by building to try and kind of have more tailored I don't want to call it focus groups, but have more tailored sessions. You just might need to break the questions down to something more specific. But I think that could be a great way to get direct feedback that will allow you to bypass some of the kind of standard groups.
I was also thinking, what resonated with what you just said, Commissioner Hooper, was like, how to break down these questions to the general public. And I started thinking also about thinking about ways we might be able to do like some visual preference surveys with pictures of like, what do you like about each, or of these three, what's the one you're drawn to, and trying to identify what design components those buildings have, because it's very hard to talk about some of these things with people that aren't used to looking at plans, or it's but the picture, the building in front of, I love that building, or every time I pass that building, here's what I like about it. So getting creative on ways that we might be able to put something together to have that interaction and a more accessible platform.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Councilmember Fisher.
Well, I was just it just came up for me in that discussion that perhaps reaching out to the local AIA chapter and seeing what their thoughts are, because they're more attuned to our local architecture and working in these communities. And that's Mary Dooley is currently the chair of the local chapter, or president. Couple comments. I want to just express my support for unbundling the parking. I think it's a necessity these days. Again, if I don't have a vehicle and I don't want one, why should I be paying for that parking space? And I should be able to have that option. I don't know. I'm really keen on also having maximum square footages, and I'm wanting to look at this so that we can, in fact, implement it for non-affordable housing projects. I do think that is the future if we're going to meet our housing standards, our housing goals, and create this sort of community that we want to see, right? And so we get more density, so we get more transit, so all those things that need to happen in my mind. And so in looking at these, don't think about it just as affordable housing, but thinking about how we're going to be able to implement it moving forward once we sort of get our general plan set and our housing element. And if we know exactly what we want where, to be able to say to a developer, here's the surety, if you build this way, go for it. Just, go to the bank, get your money, hire the contractor and get it done. Because that is the impediment. The biggest impediment for developers is the time lag. I heard it today from one of our developers. So if we can avoid that, that's how we can actually get things built. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Fisher. I have a few comments and questions myself. I was just looking at the four core pillars too, and just throwing it out there. I wonder if we could add resilience to number 1 and do like design for sustainability and resilience instead of having a whole separate one, or just throwing it out there. And I'm not sure if it needs to be another 5th one or not, but since Commissioner Ryder was the one that mentioned it first, maybe, she could comment on that. But after I'm done, maybe she could weigh in on that. And then I had a question on the attachment B, Ms. Edminster's and Mr. Gang's thoughts on objective design standards. And I don't really understand how those are going to fit in. Are those just things that you guys are going to consider to fit in, or they will be fitting in, or how? I don't understand how that's going to work. I do support them. I think most of them are great, but I'm just wondering how you're gonna, what is the process gonna look like for you going through them and then incorporating them into the final design?
I think that is an ongoing discussion. There's some of them that fit more naturally with objective design standards. There's a lot of them that maybe fit into other updates, reach codes, or other code updates that would apply more citywide than specifically to, you know, affordable housing projects that come in for streamlining. So definitely heard, I think, pretty much across the board from this commission, support of a lot of what they had to say, and we will take another look at them and, you know, where they can be incorporated into this effort, look at that, and where they maybe don't fit well into this effort, think about them in terms of subsequent efforts that we will be undertaking.
Great, thank you very much. And then just a few more comments. I know you wanted maybe ask for our opinion on the vinyl windows, which I think I would rather see them spend money on quality versus vinyl windows. So I would be in supportive of prohibiting them or having them choose other materials over that for longevity and just because they look quite cheap, and have them focus on other quality elements rather than, I agree with you, adding a lot of hodgepodge articulation and fenestrations and just letting them pick a few quality ones over quantity. So I'm in support of that also. The other thing I also am supporting is having some sort of flex use or mixed use on the bottom story somehow, if we can incorporate that. And I know that seems like a tall order, but I think I saw that Ms. Edmisters and Mr. Gang's thoughts kind of wrote about that a little bit. And so if we can incorporate something like that, just to have some sort of mixed use component to the bottom floors, some percentage of them at least, I think I would support for that for sure. And then I just had a thought, and just the maximum square footage on residential units. I see where that could be very appealing. I am a little bit worried about making it like, I think I saw somewhere like 1,800 square feet, which, you know, that might be okay, but I feel like if there were a very large family, sometimes people have 3 or 4 kids or something like that. And I don't know, maybe something like more like 2,500 would be better. I agree, like we don't need to have like 3,500 square foot houses, but 1,800 might be a little small for larger families or for extended families that have grandma and grandpa living there and things like that. That's just my thoughts on that. And I think that's all the thoughts and comments and questions that I have. Thank you, everybody. It was really awesome presentation, so thorough. Really looking forward to seeing this through. And I want to open it up for any last minute comments and questions. And maybe I see Commissioner Marzo raising his hand, and I'd like to hear back from Commissioner Ryder too on my proposal. So, Commissioner Marzo.
Thank you, Chair. I just, as we wrap this up, I just kind of want to understand the next steps of where we go vis-a-vis our participation as commissioners, because part of what I'm hearing is, and again, there are so many different ideas and great ideas going around. We've got a terrific staff report. We have interesting considerations from our stakeholder interviews. We have a third document that was prepared for us that people seem to be thinking we need to either accept or not accept in its entirety. So, and then we're talking about engaging the public. So what are the next steps? How do we participate? How do we, I guess it's going to come back to us, but I just want to learn more about the next steps vis-a-vis not only our participation, but the rest of the community, because there's a lot of voices. And at some point, again, if you're trying to get from subjective to objective, if you have a room of 10,000 voices, you're going to get 10,000 opinions. So how are we going to synthesize this into objective standards? Thank you.
Well, that is the hard work in front of staff. So we wanted to, before we kind of dug into the specifics, and we started digging into specifics, right? When Christina talked about starting on a draft, we started getting into, these have to be very, very specific. At every X linear feet, you must have a wall articulation of at least X inches, or, whatever it is. We have to get into an objective standard for all this. So before we got into that, our kind of pause was to come back and check in with the Planning Commission to get their feedback, things like the pillars. Are we forgetting anything? Is there, anything that we didn't think about, or you strongly are like, no, that's a ridiculous, concept under here, mechanism. So that's where we are, getting your feedback. We will now start looking at how do we turn these concepts into objective design standards. In doing that, we will check back in with the people we've talked to. We'll take some of your suggestions in terms of ways to reach out to a wider range of the public. And then we'll notice it and bring it back and get your further feedback on the standards before moving on to City Council. So I don't know exactly how they're going to turn out, because we're, they're half baked at this point, and we have to
the process. No.
We have to, we've gotten some great feedback. I think there's been a lot of support, and I think staff all felt support for the memo that came from Ian Edmonster and Pete Gang, but also we struggled with, do these go here, or do they go there, or do some of them go here? So we're going to have to grapple with that. And I would imagine when we do come back, those things that we maybe haven't incorporated into the objective design standards, we're going to need to provide you with some indication of, okay, so these we didn't put in, and this is why, and here's what we think why they'd be better in this effort, and have some discussion of that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to you both. Commissioner Ryder?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Bauer. Just to circle back on your inquiry about resilience, for me, this has to do with balance. And I think I'll leave it up to staff's discretion, if it were up to me entirely, to determine whether resilience should be its own pillar or combined. But when I look at the list of things, I suspect that sustainability and resilience will be quite substantial separately. And so does it make sense to have one principle that is just a larger percentage of the document overall compared to others? I don't know, but that's my gut reaction to why I would suggest to pull it out, would just simply be for balancing the principles against one another. But I don't have a strong feeling either way. I'm curious about other people's thoughts. And one just addition that came to mind during this discussion about another group of entities that we should connect with for the public engagement process. If the intent is to make sure that all these buildings are highly maintainable and have a long life, perhaps we can also bring in property managers who can inform what major things and major systems fail, at least those that are within the scope of this conversation, to be able to identify specific elements of the structure that might be prioritized objectively.
Good idea. Thank you, Commissioner Ryder. Councilmember Fisher?
Thank you. I just want to weigh in, because when you made that suggestion that sustainability and resilience go together, I had a pretty visceral reaction to it. And I think it's because those two words mean very different things to me. And to become resilient versus sustainability are two, in my mind, very different concepts even. So I would keep them separate for that reason.
Good. Thank you very much. Good point. And I just had one other comment that I forgot to mention, and that is the EV charging stations. And I think if we're going to have a goal of carbon neutrality in the next, coming decades, I think everybody is we're going to have to switch over to carbon-free vehicles. And I know in the Ann Edmonster's and Pete Gang's thoughts, they say they would like EV charging station for every parking space. And I know that sounds like a lot, given right now we're only doing a small percentage, but I would be supportive of that if that weren't like completely cost prohibitive of the housing units. So I just wanted to say that I think that's where we need to go, and otherwise I feel like people are going to be fighting over EV charging stations at some point. I don't know how we would distribute them, who gets them, you know, how do we share them, that type of thing. So more the better, put it that way. So are there any other comments or questions? And if not, Planning Manager Hines, let us know now if there's anything missing, or Ms. Paul, if there's any other things that you want from us at this point.
I think this has been a helpful conversation. I appreciate everyone's thoughtfulness and preparation to have this discussion, and we will be hard at work making it into something that we can then get through Dylan and Eric's office and return for review and recommendation and move it on.
Okay, great. Thank you. Ms. Paul, is that all for you for right now?
Yeah, no, thank you all very much for your input. We look forward to getting into the weeds with you all.
All right, thank you very much. And with that, our next meeting is on May 11th. And for now, we'll adjourn this meeting. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.